Welcome, beloved listeners, to another awards night here on LNL, an occasion where we hand out one of our precious koala stamps. There is a prevailing view that all my friends are either antiques or antiquities. I'm going to prove that's not the case because I'm about to introduce you to a remarkably young fella and a remarkable young fella in Matt Noffs. But to put this in context, before I let him loose on you, let me tell you a story. Many, many years ago, a young bloke called John Embling wandered into my office with an unpublished manuscript called simply Tom. John was a school teacher, and he tried to salvage this very damaged kid, a fully fledged member of the post-industrial wasteland, and he did. The book, Tom, A Child's Life Regained, became a major bestseller for Penguin. I made a movie version called Fighting Back. And then John, his colleague Heather Pilcher and I formed an outfit called Families in Distress. And all it was a little weatherboard house in the industrial or the post-industrial wasteland of the western suburbs of Melbourne. That little place salvaged the lives of so many kids who were virtually roadkill, just sort of victims of society so dramatically changing gears. And John and Heather, working 24/7 for year after year after year, not only saved those kids, but a great many of their absolutely crushed single mums. The work went on for years. My job was to raise money for it because no government, state or federal, showed the slightest interest in them. And so every year I'd write a couple of columns about it, and people, from the goodness of their heart, horrified by the stories we told, would keep them going. Well, Families in Distress ended its operations a couple of years ago when John and Heather, both absolutely exhausted and from the unremitting labours and both quite ill, retired. And at about that same time, a young bloke walked into my office, and it was like the John Embling experience all over again, except this was Matt Noffs, the grandson of the sainted Reverend Theodore or Ted Noffs, who used to run the Wayside Chapel in King's Cross. I lived in King's Cross for some years, and this, of course, was the sacred site in that theme park for human misery. He founded the Wayside Foundation as far back as 1970 with a profound commitment to helping adolescents with drug and alcohol problems and engaging the community at many levels. Ted was a trailblazer. He got funds from both government and business to set up facilities for the disadvantaged. Now cut from the same cloth, it's no surprise that Matt is following in the family tradition and is co-founder with his wife Naomi of the Street University. Now, well, he'll explain it in due course, but it's a fantastic idea. And not only has it caught on and survived, but it's now spawning, or about to, replica operations in other parts of the world. There are two in Western Sydney and calls for one in Perth, Melbourne, and a Bush University to travel to the desert. And it's no surprise to find Matt involved in the currently intensifying debate regarding drug decriminalisation or legislation. Matt, when did we meet?
It was 2004, and I think you're dramatically underselling the part that you played in my life there. I mean, we began talking about those ideas, but the kind of the metaphors that you've kind of fed to me over the years have been amazing. I mean, one of the very first things was I remember you talking about young people these days have an opportunity to be all of these different things, and yet we pigeonhole ourselves and we pigeonhole our young people into this one idea. And you talked about this metaphor of the Chinese plate juggler. that to balance all of these plates and to allow for you to smash is actually a beautiful thing. And that was the beginning for me to a synthesis of ideas to start a street university.
Well, before we get on to this remarkable concept of yours, I just want to go back to Ted, because I now know 4 generations of Noffs, because you got a baby you brought around the other day. But tell us about your grandpa. What was his, the reverend? What sort of reverend was he?
Well, he was a heretic. I mean, he was charged by the church for heresy over 3 times. And he used to say, he said it on ABC once, that if it was any earlier in history, he probably would have been burnt for his ideas. And so that's the kind of reverend he was. He was a heretic because he said that Jesus wasn't a god, and that any one of us could live that kind of life. That Buddha was just as important as Jesus. To be an atheist was just as important as being a Christian, and the church hated that idea. The family of humanity was what he used to talk about. No one in the world is a stranger to me.
He did work sort of embling type miracles, didn't he, at the Wayside?
And it's interesting that you mentioned about the government funding, because it took a lot to get there for him. I mean, I found a folder with an idea called the Wayside University, and this was after we'd developed Street University and opened it up, and he'd asked for money from the government in the 70s, and they were still saying no. And he was the first person in the country to recognise the drug problem, and someone was saying the other day that the foundation was one of the first, if not the first, drug and alcohol rehabilitation in the country. So he was very ahead of his time, but it took a lot. In fact, he'd written a poem about Bob Hawke that was it wasn't the most pleasant thing, and that's when Bob Hawke turned up on his step and said, "All right, let's do this." So he
converted Hawke.
He converted Hawke. That's right. I mean, the politicians didn't take any notice of Ted for a very long time. It wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s, and by that stage, Prince Charles and kings and all sorts of people were kings of Thailand and all sorts of people were starting to pay attention, because they noticed this horror movie develop in slow motion, and that really no one was on top of it. Certainly the medical profession wasn't on top of it, and Ted had to try and get them involved as well.
He was a very modest man, wasn't he?
In some respects, but he was also a song and dance man. I mean, he knew how to. He loved writing poems, and he loved talking about these great big ideas like the family of humanity. And you've talked about the idea of the family of humanity too. It's a concept that it doesn't matter what you believe in.
Nothing that is human is alien to me.
Yeah, and I don't know what the Latin is that, but there's a Latin version as well. And that concept is a beautiful idea, and to this day is still rare. And so when I say he's a song and dance man, I mean that he knew how to get attention, and you need to in this industry.
I know it's interesting that the only politician that took the slightest interest in families in distress was Fred Chaney, then Senator Fred Chaney, who I think would have been a wonderful Liberal Prime Minister. I think he resigned from the Liberal Party in the not too distant past. But he was the only politician that ever took the slightest interest in us. But I seem to recall that Kevin Rudd took an interest in you.
Yeah, I think it was a part of either Sydney Morning Herald or The Australian did a thing and had us up in Canberra, winning some award, and Kevin Rudd was making a speech talking about these different ideas, and he mentioned Street University. So Naomi kind of nudged me and said, go up and have a chat to him. And there was my name badge at the front next to Wayne Swan's, and Wayne hadn't picked his up or didn't arrive. So I picked up Wayne Swan's and I put on Wayne's badge and walked up to Kevin. And as I approached, I could tell his face was worried, and he kind of looked to see if his security was near. And I talked about this idea of kind of creating this social enterprise and trying to get the government behind this. Behind doing this shoe, an Australian sneaker company for young people, very similar to how you try to get the government into films. This was something that I felt that, and to this day, still feel like the government, if they're interested in manufacturing, this is something that every kid loves. So yes,
we'll talk about the strange shoes later. But he did, in fact, bond with you, didn't he?
Yeah, I like Kevin. I think he is a lovely bloke, and he's genuine, he's authentic, and yeah, I think he's easy to get along with. I mean, there are people who aren't easy to get along with in politics. Another person who I adore is Bob Carr. You know, he would actually call me up when I was a nobody at the age of 23. He would call me up to his office to talk about trying to create a riot prevention plan. And we were in the middle of doing this. This was before Cronulla riots. And his team and he'd sit there with his lemon and hot water and talk about what do we need to do. Because one of the first things I addressed with him was to get up in the media and to slam young people in the media is one sure way to start a riot. And of course we saw a whole load of riots happen during that time. So Bob Carr, Kevin Rudd, and then there are other more difficult personalities that I've dealt with along the way. But those two guys are lovely blokes, genuine blokes as well.
The war on drugs has conspicuously failed. This alleged cure is not only worse than the disease, but is in fact the disease. Now, I know you've written an article not yet published for the SMH. What's your current line as the current Noffs line on drugs?
I think one of the first things that we need to address when we're talking about decriminalisation and legalisation is that there needs to be some sort of education because no one really, well, not no one, a large bulk of the population don't understand the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation. And the thing that needs to be understood is that the way to think of decriminalisation is, as the word says, takes the crime out of drug use. And I think that that's a very humane idea, and it's a beautiful one as well, and something we need to address. And it's something that's not too difficult. I mean, we've seen in states like the ACT and Western Australia and the Northern Territory, decriminalisation being picked up. On the other hand, we have legalisation, and legalisation, in my mind, is a bit like socialism or communism. It's a really beautiful, encompassing idea that wants to take care of its family. But as it approaches reality, are we going to see something where the human part of that actually falls out of place? In other words, is your kilo of heroin really going to be cheaper from the government or from your old dealer? Is it actually going to destroy a black market, or is it actually just going to create more competition in the market? I mean, it's a difficult one. And so I think if we're going to head towards something sooner rather than later, politicians are shit scared of the legalisation idea. But decriminalisation is already happening. In fact, Australia is quite advanced in terms of how we approach that. So that's the first thing.
Yes, the notion of harm minimalisation, thanks to Alex Wodak and others, is not entirely unknown.
No, and Alex is a wonderful person and knows how to use controversy to stir debate, and certainly that's what he's done here. But we actually need the politicians on side with this. And
Wouldn't it astonish Ted to think that, 40 years, 50 years down the track, we're still having exactly the same discussion?
In a way, but he also believed that we were always just going to be behind the problem. He never thought we were going to surpass it. And he used to say, Jesus would always say that you will always have the poor. You will always have a drug problem. You will always have these issues. But we can be close to that issue. We can be close to that solution. We will never properly find one. So it's how we treat these issues in a humane way that's more important.
John Embling used to talk about saving kids from homicide or suicide. That was the target. These were kids that didn't simply fall through the crack. They tumbled forever, off cliffs the size of the Gap. And the system couldn't cope, didn't know what to do with them. So sometimes a magistrate would pass a kid who'd been totally demolished over to John and Heather, and they'd slave over this kid, trying to give him a life or a second chance, or in many cases a first chance, given that they'd never had a chance to begin with. You cast a far wider net than that. Who was the target for the Street University?
Well, I think you're right. One of the first things that we recognised was that in our other programs there was a very it was a thicker net in a way. It was targeting young people in our rehabilitation centres who were very close to death, who were caught up in the juvenile detention system, and who had serious drug and alcohol problems. So it had occurred to me that people were doing less and less prevention, and I think that prevention is probably not the right term to use here, but to actually look at how you create an intervention service. How do you catch these kids? Well, juvenile justice would call this population pre-entry into the system. And how do you catch these kids? To this day, people are still asking that question. So Street University was an attempt to say, let's not put a specific kind of kid down in a pigeonhole. Oh, that's a drug kid, that's a crime kid, that's a homeless kid, that's an education kid. But actually say, how can we capture or hook, is the term that Naomi and I use, how can you hook these kids in as they're approaching the precipice? And certainly the net is probably just under the precipice, but closer to the top, where something like the rehab is further down the bottom. So the Street University tries to capture the kids who are probably just starting to use drugs, just involved with a lot of dealing drugs, or just on the edge where they're still able to, you're able to capture them and get them back onto the plateau. So that's the kind of group that we're aiming for.
One of the remarkable things about Families in Distress, in essence, a weatherboard house, was the ethnicity of the kids. There were kids from Aboriginal background, Pacific Island, almost every country on earth were in that small space. That's the same with the Street University. I remember being gobsmacked by the ethnic variety.
Well, I mean, that's also something that you could say about Southwest Sydney. So you have a large population of African kids from all sorts of different African nations. You have kids from a background of, you could say, Iraq, Afghanistan, Cambodia, the Pacific Islands, and the Aboriginal kids as well. So there's a huge a variety of people from different backgrounds, and it's their parents who have been the asylum seekers or the recently arrived migrants. And so working with these kids on very basic levels. So, Naomi worked with two kids whose father was killed by the Taliban, and their mum didn't have the best English, and so they were coming home with their homework every day, and the mum couldn't help them with it. Naomi would sit down with them every day to help them with this, and they were really bright kids, and they ended up getting into medicine last year, which was just amazing. And it's easy for us to dismiss the kind of support that these areas need, but that's the kind of support that can really transform lives. The
kids that I observed very closely in Victoria were clearly the object of fear and loathing, but there was also, of course, tensions amongst them, between them. Is that something you've got to deal with your cornucopia?
I think areas like Mount Druitt, where we're starting to we've been working Mount Druitt for a long time, but building the new Street University there, one of the issues that has come up is the relationship between the Indigenous people in the area and the islanders. And people are talking about this a lot, and one of the discussions that came up was, if you allow a space for islanders, do you then actually push away the Indigenous kids? My feeling about that is that you can create a space that is like a womb and can include everyone, that is inclusive and not exclusive. So, but how do you do that? I mean, it really is, you have to be incredibly sensitive to why there is a difference or why there's a conflict there in the first place. So you already have people, the Indigenous people who are in that area, whether they were there, whether their tribes had settled there possibly hundreds or thousands of years ago, and suddenly you have these recently arrived migrants just come into the area with a complete different set of ideals and cultures, and so that to be sensitive to that is difficult, and I don't think government's equipped for that kind of relationship building, but it's a challenge, yeah.
LNL, RN, my guest is Matt Noffs, and we're talking about the Street University. Street's a great adjective. I'm wondering whether university was a well-chosen noun. Surely that would be a bit off-putting to the kids that you're trying to hook.
No, the opposite, because it was it's an authority that is explicit. One of the worst things I think you can do when you're setting up a service is call it an acronym. You know, there are so many acronyms out there for young people. I could rattle off a whole load now, but I'm not going to put anyone off. My feeling is an acronym is academic, has an authority. It straight away says, if I've got the acronym and you're the kid, I'm saying to you, I know something you don't. I'm not going to bother explaining to you what it is. You'll just learn in time. So it's a kind of, the relationship is off balance from the beginning. The idea, if I say to you street university, one of the best things about the idea of street university is that it throws an image into your mind. And that's something that you taught me a long time ago as well. You know, the idea of metaphor is really important. So it's a metaphor above anything else. But the idea of university is so far away for these young people that it gives them a sense that they are entitled to something greater.
It gives them at least a scintilla of dignity.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's exciting for them. And I always love what Raymond Gator says about university. A university isn't particularly a place that where research is happening or there's a sense of academia. A university is a place where ideas are founded, where ideas are bashed around. There's something you talk about, the idea that what happens with ideas when they crunch together and they form new ones, and that's the idea of a university.
I think we should describe the physicality of the first street university, just in case the listener is getting the wrong impression. It's do it for me.
Okay, it's from the outside. It looks like an abandoned warehouse, and when you walk inside, it's something out of the ordinary. There's a basketball court on the inside. There's 2 levels of classrooms. There's a cafe out the front. There's music studios. There's a library. But from the outside, it's meant to look very, very plain. The idea is that when you walk inside, you've discovered something, a secret. And there's some beautiful concepts from overseas which I'd stolen the ideas from. There was one idea in San Francisco called the Pirate Shop. And from the outside, it looks like a pirate shop. And when you walk in behind that, there's actually an alternative education centre. So the idea that an abandoned warehouse is somehow holding a secret universe inside where you can discover yourself. I mean, that's the idea, and that's what the environment captures. It's very, it's filled with spray paint, loud music, and it's very inviting for that kind of young person.
Yeah. What happens to someone who's been hooked, to use your term?
Well, Naomi calls it hooks, breaks, cranes and trains. You hook the kid in, you help cease their drug use, their involvement with crime, their homelessness. So you put a brake to those things.
Sorry, how?
Well,
John and Heather endlessly talked about rights and responsibilities, setting limits. If a kid wanted help, he had to earn the right to help by helping the other kids. You don't like that, do you?
It's not that I don't like that. It's just a different way of doing things. If a young person comes in and says, a young person normally doesn't come in straight away and say, I'm homeless. He'll take his time because his sense of pride is there, especially for a street kid who a lot of them are very opportunistic and are in a sense living in a jungle. So they take
often very skillfully too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're evolved compared to you and I. If you and I landed on the street, we don't know what the first thing to do is. We don't. So we've kind of grown up in a different landscape. So when they finally do say to us, look, I'm homeless, the break would be, or how do we work with that young person, is to say, you call up and you find housing for them. So 2 days ago, a young boy came in and said, I don't have a place to stay. And we called up every single accommodation service set up by the government and non-government, and we couldn't find a place for him anywhere. So we had to pay $40 to get him into a hostel. And that's the kind of thing we're dealing with. So that's how we approach that issue. A young person who's using drugs, it'll take some time for them to say, I've got a problem with ice or with even with cannabis or alcohol. So it's what kind of help can we do there? It's about counselling. It's about working with them to see what's actually behind the drug use, is abuse at home and all the rest of it. And that's a much longer term issue. That's the break.
One of the great things that Families in Distress established was that the next generation of helpers came from the past generation of the redeemed, if you like. So the older kids would then help the younger kids. Do many of your students, after graduating from the Street University, stick around and
mentor? That's right. Yeah, a lot of them do, and some of them have just decided they've discovered themselves. They've become an expert in something. We get a lot of filmmakers, kids. There's one boy I love to talk about who I found who'd failed the HSC. He was bombing trains at night, spray painting trains. He was he was in an abusive household. And to cut a long story short, he's ended up getting into university. We recently won an award from University of Western Sydney, but really the award should go to them for allowing a lot of these kids who there would be no way that the system would allow them in, to get into university, to study things like filmmaking. And he's off now. He's got a T-shirt manufacturing business and he's a filmmaker. He was in there yesterday. So some of them lead by example and others literally lead. So they mentor, sit down with a young person and say, I've been where you've been. And but that's not for everyone. I mean, that's for...
What about the sound recording facilities? What happens there?
So there's two...
And you've introduced me to some of your young musos, who are rap musicians of one sort or another, who convert the angers of their life into pretty powerful music.
Yeah, so in a sense, you could kind of call it... There's two things here, actually, I need to distinguish. Is one, the music is a hook in itself. I mean, we had a famous hip-hopper there the other week who was one of the founders of hip-hop from the US. He's an older guy called KRS-One. Now, that doesn't mean much to you and I, but in terms of the world of hip-hop, there's a whole lot of listeners right now going, oh my God, they had KRS-One there. And to have him there to talk about the philosophy of hip-hop is really important. That's a hook. To be able to come in and just to lay down a rap is a hook. It's getting them in the door and giving them those kind of, that technology. But for other kids, it is a form of narrative therapy. It allows them to talk about their story through the idea of a narrative, so saying this is where I'm at, or this is how I'm going to, fight against the struggle in my life, fight against the system or whatever. So it's an outlet. It can be a form of releasing that anger, like you say, but in another sense, it's actually just getting them in there to look at the more serious aspects of what's happening. One
of the problems at Families in Distress was the failure rate. John and Heather would rescue, say, a 14-year-old prostitute, and they'd get her to stop truanting. They'd get her to go to the school. They'd negotiate with the school so the school didn't sort of try to stop her getting in, effectively. But as I said, for every well, that's not quite right, but they still spent a lot of time going to funerals because very often you'd make a promise to a kid, study, try hard, behave yourself, and there'll be a payoff. But very often, because of the economic troubles in this country over the last decades, there was no payoff.
I think that it's a really interesting thing when we try and get... I mean, the Indigenous issue is like this. It always astonishes me that we talk about trying to get Indigenous people employed. I mean, that's a very broad concept, but that's how we talk about it. We have to remember that when we're talking about Indigenous employment, that when we rocked up, when Whiteys rocked up, Indigenous people across Australia were spending their time under trees during the day, would go off to find a kangaroo when they needed something to eat, and come back and sit underneath a tree. Our concept of work is completely different, and we're always trying to fit other people, whether it's Indigenous people, a street kid, whoever it is, a young African boy. We're always trying to fit that person into our world, into our way of doing something, a 14-year-old prostitute. We're trying to fit her into our world, into our system. But why? Why not actually adapt the system? Why not create a new system that sits parallel to this? And I'm not talking about idealistic ideas. I mean, if you look at some really successful people like yourself, like people I know who have fashioned a career for themselves, they don't sit in a system. How do you describe all of the things that you've achieved? By saying to someone, how you can't, if you say Phillip Adams broadcaster, you are completely undermining the rest of your life. And that's what I say to these young people. I'm not here to get you into the system. I'm not here to make you the government wants me to turn you into a good mortgage paying citizen. That's not my job. You can go to another organisation who can do that for you. What I'm interested in doing is trying to turn you into a Chinese plate juggler, trying to show you how to manage all of the different creative aspects of your life and use them essentially to your advantage, to survive, to thrive.
Tell me about the library.
The library, well, one of the things I was saying to someone last night was one of the things we really do need to do with the library is have a digital aspect for it. I mean, now people are reading books on iPads, and you can really sense with the kids that the idea of a book is becoming an old-fashioned, an antique in a sense. But it's had some great successes in itself. There was one boy who unfortunately passed away in a car accident, but Naomi had given him, she decided to grab the first book out of the library for him, and he hadn't been able to read. He could grab bits and pieces here, but she spent some time with him, and she gave him a book and said, read this on the train. She gave him the Da Vinci Code. And he said, are people going to think I'm strange reading this? And she said, no. And at the time she said, everyone's reading it. Read this book and no one's going to think you're strange. Anyway, she said, just get to the end of the first chapter for me and tell me how you go. Within 2 days, he'd called and said, I can't remember the guy's name, the lead character in it, but she said, he called after 2 days. He's 3 paragraphs in, and she said, does he know what he's doing? They're going to kill him. And she was astonished, and he'd finished the book within 6 weeks, and suddenly he discovered a pleasure for reading, similar to how you talk about walking into the library and the librarians doing the same thing for you.
Giving me the grapes of wrath in my case.
That's right. And
well chosen.
Well chosen compared to Da Vinci Code, but he went on from reading the Da Vinci Code to other things. He'd not only done that, but he got back into school. He realised that he had a capacity to learn outside of what the system had given him.
See, one of the things that people axiomatically assume is that these kids aren't bright.
That's right.
That's the profound prejudice.
That's right.
And they're smart as whips.
That's
Not
right.
all of them, but a great many of them are.
So
really
why don't people like you and I, and certainly Ted, failed the equivalent of the HSC 3 times to try and get into university? Why do people like us not fit in? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
That's not your turn to interrogate me,
come
young
on,
man.
come on.
No. This is Matt Noffs. We're discussing his...
I'm trying to... The grasshopper is trying to be like the praying mantis. No, in all seriousness, my perspective on that is that some of us learn differently. Some of us I learn kinesthetically. I can't sit still in a meeting for longer than 10 minutes without having to get up and walk around. And certainly 80% of the kids that we see don't learn visually or auditory. And a lot of that, the way that our schools are set up, is through low lighting, a person standing at the front of the classroom, and for nearly an hour they're going to point at a whiteboard and tell you to absorb that information.
I was never any good at that.
Right.
Couldn't do it to save myself.
And if I took a guess, it's because you learn in a different way. It's not that you learn any less, but if you're able to listen or walk around or absorb your ideas in a different way...
Well, I don't know. For me, it was, I lived in families in distress, a couple of them in sequence. And in that intense loneliness, I read. That was all I did. I read. And what I discovered was that I didn't so much learn from the books I read as find confirmation in them. Right. In other words, I'm 5 years old and I'm an atheist. I wouldn't even know I'd never heard the word. I wouldn't hear it for another 10 years probably. But then I'd read Bertrand Russell in my teens. Oh, that's what I am, So, and I know a lot of people who are like that. Keating's an autodidact, as you know. And a lot of people who really have maintained their curiosity or even intensified it because they didn't have a conventional education.
I think that's right. I mean, I think being able to... I studied English at university, but I didn't actually find my love for books until I was out of university. And it actually, when the authority was removed, I found the same thing. When I automatically could attach to a book, that's when I fell in love with it.
John intellectualised, and still does, his work. He's an incredible reader, and he used to write me 1 or 2 letters a day sometimes. I'm still delighted to get one every now and again. In his incredibly big, sweeping handwriting, pouring out ideas. But a lot of the things that John was doing at Families in Distress were referenced back to people who had inspired him, particularly in the ghettos of the US. Has your work been that powerfully influenced by others, or has it been more ad hoc?
Oh well, I'd be lying if I didn't say that Ted influenced me, and I'd be really lying about that. But I tried to find a lot of my heroes outside of my work. So what I've actually discovered recently is a lot of my heroes are melancholics. You know, I think people like Kurt Vonnegut Jr. I mean, Kurt Vonnegut was a pen pal with Ted, and Ted would say to him, "Kurt, we can do this. Let's get the kids marching to stop Vietnam or whatever." And Kurt would write back saying, "Let's leave it to them, Ted," or "We can't do it, Ted." Or, you know, the idea was it was always a crushing defeat. But it was also that sense of so it goes and all the rest of it. So a lot of my heroes actually don't have answers, but they open up a can of worms, so more questions pour out. So I actually don't find my inspiration so much in what other people have done. I mean, certainly, you know, there have been people like Gandhi out there who are amazing to watch. But at the same time, I think a lot of my heroes are actually people who have a grim perspective on reality. I don't know. I'm not like that. Sometimes I wish I was, but they fill me up with a sense of this is how the world is. Perhaps we can add a little light. It's just not for me to do.
I'm talking to Matt Noffs, who's the grandson of Ted, who established Sydney's first 24-hour crisis centre in 1968 and set up the first drug referral centre in Sydney, co-founded the Aboriginal Affairs Foundation, and was the co-founder of Lifeline in 1963, so it must be in the genes. Matt, you're wearing strange shoes. Would you mind telling me what the hell they're on about?
We started a social enterprise about a year and a half ago now called Gideon Shoes. And it essentially was born out of the frustration of me seeing a lot of these kids walk around in Nikes and Adidas and these kind of sneakers, which have a large part to play in hip-hop culture. And one of the most frustrating things for me was to see that these kids had no idea that these things were developed by blokes walking around in suits and ties. That, in fact, it wasn't... And
made by kids working in sweatshops in Asia.
Well, that was certainly the next episode. But the very first part of it was this frustration that this hip-hop culture, this culture which was meant to be about a freedom and an exploration of ideas, was actually, in the beginning, more about being sold this idea. And so what I said to them is, let's create our own shoe company. Let's try and manufacture them in an ethical way. And that didn't interest them so much. I mean, it's hard to see what kind of exploitation goes into manufacturing, not just shoes, but a lot of the things that we use. And so I got obsessed with people like William Wilberforce, and I travelled to China, and I actually visited sweatshops, real sweatshops, and filmed inside of them. And to look at this, and actually I'd gone to China to discover if there was an ethical manufacturer in China, and didn't find one. Obviously, I mean, you know, you'd have to probably spend a long time if one existed at all. And so to try and create not just a shoe but a symbol for perhaps a new way of dealing with this crisis in our world, which is, as the way I see it, modern day slavery. So we created a shoe company, manufactured them in Australia, and started shipping them out.
What are they made of?
They're made of, the sneakers are made of leather, mainly kangaroo leather, but also some of them are made from cane toads as well.
That was a Dorothy Dixon. I'm aware of it. What the hell does a cane toad contribute to the comfort of the foot?
Nothing, but the symbol of
you can always suck the shoe, can't you, if you want to high.
Well, this symbol, I mean, a lot of people get obsessed with the cane toad. Thank God you're dealing with the cane toad problem, all the rest of it. I mean, I'm not dealing with the cane toad problem, and I don't know if I have a huge interest there. But I think as I started putting cane toads on the side of shoes, more and more people started coming out of the woodwork, green pollies and all sorts of people saying, let's start an industry, because there wasn't one. I mean, the cane toad leathers aren't coming from Australia, as I discovered, unfortunately, after we put them on the shoes. We were told they were coming from Queensland, only to discover that a bloke in Queensland is actually getting them from Asia, where they happily put them to sleep in fridges and then skin them. And 2 weeks ago, a bloke, after hearing me talk about this on US radio, called and said, I'll skin them for you if you can deliver them. And part of me plays with this concept. I don't think you can use all the leather for for shoes, certainly. But using them for other things like fertilizer is a great idea. We haven't been. I've always perceived the cane toad thing, because the more I get into it, I mean, you can hear I'm saying I'm not interested in it, but a part of me is.
But a lot of people are. NPR got quite intrigued with your cane toad footwear, didn't they?
Well, just the idea of the shoes as well. I mean, because I mean, part of the guy who was interviewing me for NPR, who was a lovely bloke, was really, told me I was a purist, and that I wasn't really, going to make as much profit as I wanted until I started, really looking at manufacturing in perhaps, China. So ultimately I could, throw more profits at the street university. But I said to him, that wasn't the idea. I mean, the notion of standing for something, even if I fail, so that I can inspire someone else who can probably do it better than I can, is more important.
I must say, you brought some very strange ideas to my house over the years. Not so long ago, you turned up with a couple of mates carrying a coffin, and it was had lovely Egyptian iconography stuck all over it. It's still stuck in the bloody driveway. Why did you bring a coffin to my house? Did you want to encourage me to depart?
No, there's my father-in-law was one of the inventors of the cardboard coffin, and it was an environmental idea, and it is a brilliant idea. They're out there. You can get them through Life Art, they're called, and
with any decoration on it you like.
Any decoration on it you like, and they're actually made from, what did he say? You'll remember the recycled cardboard, but sugarcane as well. And I think it's a great idea, and some people really get into it. I mean, being buried with the smallest carbon footprint possible is a beautiful concept. It's a scary one, but yeah.
So that's one of the things you do, isn't it? Intuitively, you look around for ideas which have got sort of ethical dimensions as well, as perhaps a hint of a profit in them.
Maybe, yeah, but maybe this guy from NPR was right. Maybe I'm not so interested in the profit in the end.
Okay, if your shoes are raising interest in the US, the street university is also becoming an international intrigue, isn't it?
Well, some people like to tell me that I'm splitting my focus, and I should just focus on one of them. And the street university idea is an idea for all time, and that the shoes idea is an idea that its time hasn't come yet. And maybe that's true. And in a sense, I had a sense that I would deliver these shoes to the world, and that everyone would stand behind them and say, "Hooray! Let's stand behind this and end modern day slavery once and for all." And that didn't happen. Sure that, people are buying them online. But my feeling of that is that people actually didn't care as much as I thought they would. So in a sense, I felt like I'd failed on that front. So other people say to me, just drop that, let it run as a small business on the side, and focus on the street universities and build more of these things around the world. What Naomi and I want to do is not necessarily build these things ourselves, but give the idea away.
Not franchise,
open source.
Yeah.
Open source would be the in the current jargon, and give that idea away and show people how to do that. I mean, that's the most important thing I think you can do. If Naomi and I built as many street universities on the same time frame and the budget of the current one, by the time we were dead, we'd build another 6 if we were lucky. So I think the idea of giving the idea away and allowing people to hook these young people in, or as juvenile justice would say, find the pre-entry kids, I think is a very important one.
One of the reasons John and Heather weren't the solution to all Victoria's social woes is there was John and Heather, and it was very hard to replicate John and Heather, though there was, as I said, some of the kids stuck around to help. The other problem here is that there's only a few Noffs.
I disagree.
I know you're breeding one at the moment.
That's right, purely for fundraising purposes as well. But the I disagree with you here. I mean, my feeling is I don't spend that much time out in Liverpool. I'm out, trying to get the rest of the operations happening and managing all of those in 5 days. And the less time I spend in Liverpool, the more it flourishes, the more kids they see, the more exciting ideas they come up with. So the less I have to do with it, the more it flourishes. My feeling is that you can go in and start these things, kickstart them, and allow the community to run them themselves. I think that's an important idea, and I disagree. I think that founders should walk in, start something, and stand back and trust that the community can do these things themselves if they have the right guidelines.
It's a pretty daring thing to do.
Oh, but who cares? At the end of the day, you may as well give it a shot. And if you fail, you know better than anything else the government has tried.
How many kids have passed through Street University 1 in the last couple of years?
Last couple of years, I'd say well over 3,000. I mean, we're getting
bloody hell.
I mean, we know we're registering around 14,000 visits a year. I've just installed a machine which registers this. We've signed up a membership thing, and the kids are going crazy for it. And so now we're actually gauging, the ratio of boys and girls and ages and those kind of things. But yeah, we're registering around 14,000 visits a year, and that comes down to around 3,000 kids, individuals.
And yet you haven't had a lot of publicity.
I don't know. I think we've had a lot. I mean, I don't go after it in a sense. I think that I always say to the group there, if you're doing the best job you can, the money will come. People will hear a story and want to donate, and also the media will come too. I don't like going after it so much because I don't know. There's something artificial about that.
The other day, Dick Smith was sitting where you're sitting, and of course he's a friend of Ted's, and Dick was grizzling, rightly so, about the lack of philanthropic zeal in Australia, particularly amongst, sad to say, the new money coming out of communism. Do philanthropists come knocking at the door? Yeah,
I don't understand that. I mean, Dick there's an article I've got of Dick and Ted on our wall at the office, and it's Dick Smith. This is in the 70s. Dick Smith calls for philanthropists to cough up the money bags, and he was talking about the same thing in the 70s. I think Dick is rare in that way of giving a lot of money away, but I actually don't think that. What was it? I think was he saying 30% only 30% of millionaires.
I'm no good at statistics.
Only 30%. Only 30% of millionaires give their money away. But I think people who resonate with our idea, a guy from the US who'd been involved with Dell had heard about what we were doing through the journalist at NPR and got in touch. And I think when your idea resonates with some people, they want to donate, they want to contribute, they want to do things. And certainly, if you find someone like yourself who can communicate that idea, then people gravitate towards that. So I disagree. I think a lot of people are generous. And I think that right now, in a time when people feel like there's a lot of suffering, I don't think people are more stingy. I actually think they're more generous. And I think we saw that with the tsunami back in 2004. Australians got in there and as Dick would say, cough up the money bags. And
the thing I found, I'd write a column, 2 a year in the Oz, and we'd pull in $1 million in donations from all over Australia for that little weatherboard house in Melbourne. But the thing that I found most touching was not the $10,000 donation from someone in Collins Street. It was the $10 or the $5 donation from a pensioner, someone who really couldn't afford it. And the generosity of Australians was always astonished me.
I think we are. This NPR journalist, when he travelled over here, and he said, "Take me out to southwest Sydney," and I showed him around. I showed him King's Cross. At the end of all of it, he said to me, "You guys don't have a problem." And I said, I've shown him, this is where the drug dealing's happening, all the rest of it. How many murders had happened in Liverpool over the last few years? And I said I was around 9 a year, on average. And he said, that's nothing.
That's Shangri-La compared to what he's...
And he said, why is that? And he said, your government must be good. And I said, a lot of people would disagree with that. But then when I thought about it, I thought, if you do compare us to the UK and the US... we are good when it comes to taking care of others. We are generous.
Are your kids interested in politics?
Some of them are. I mean, you've met one of them, a bloke called El Fresh, is incredibly interested. I mean, he's Indian, a young Indian boy. I mean, he's Australian, but his parents were Indian, came from India. He's a Sikh. He is the future Prime Minister. I mean, that is the kind of Prime Minister that we're going to be seeing in the next 20 or 30 years. And the new face of Australia certainly isn't white. It is probably a darker skin. And I think that that excites me so much to see that all these young kids who come from other countries who are interested.
Okay, that's some of them, and yes, there's some spectacular cases, but I would suspect that most of the kids would be more interested in social media than signing up for a political party.
I think social media is probably overrated in that sense. But no, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. I think the rare few, I mean, generally in all our population who's interested in politics, really, not many people. So it's the same thing with Street University. They represent that population.
You've flirted with politics a few times. Let's not go into the details, but I think you could have got pre-selection for one or another party. Ever tempted?
Yeah, regularly, because there's a sense that you can make change in Canberra or on Macquarie Street. There's a sense that you can do things. But what I noticed when I dipped my head under the water was it was as messy as we perceive it to be from the outside. It is as messy, and I think that while there's the allure there's also a danger that you can lose yourself. And if it wasn't for guiding forces, unnamed, then I probably would have followed that path.
Okay, I'm going to give you koala stab now.
Okay, thank you.
Look after it, won't you?
Yes, I will. Is it a scratch and sniff?
No, it's not a scratch and sniff.
Okay.
Behave yourself. No, look, Matt Noffs, thanks for coming in. And there you go, listener, a young Australian who's moving and shaking in some very original ways. As the oldest newspaper columnist in the country, I've seen thousands come and go. My current favourite is Elizabeth Farrelly, and she'd be my guest on the next LNL. Matt, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Philip.
Time for the news. Dear listener, stick around on RN and listen to it.